On to chapter 4, which is money and money markets. So what we're going to do in this chapter is explore our economic system and the kind of organizational factors that shape the motivations of money and money markets. So in the last chapter, chapter 3, we saw how modern life is moved by social and psychological desires and status for social connection and that type of thing. Uh, but these desires aren't fixed, as we discussed. They're they're fluid and they're cultural. And what we're going to find out also is that not all cultures hold the same views, and we learned that too in the last chapter, as the industrialized world does, about how exchange for value works. I refer you again, I'm going to say this many, many times, to A Poor Man Shames His Song. You see very different ways of thinking about the exchange for value. But the economy is certainly uh, the most powerful, I would say, probably in the material aspect, not the ideal, but we're going to look at the idea and the ideas about the economy as well. A powerful part of how this all, operates in a sense. So through interaction with culture and social psychology, and all the things we've learned about social ties and goods and sentiment, all of that, it actively creates material motivation, the economy. That's one of the things it does. And it's so powerful that it intuitively feels like there's nothing we can do about it. It's just, it is what it is. That's the way it is. We're doomed to work at, uh, many of us, unfortunately, at jobs that don't mean anything to us, that don't pay well, etc. And it's one of the reasons that I'm sure that you're all in college is to uh, increase your opportunities to have more meaningful work and higher paying work. And it's true. It's probably the key threshold to that is a college degree. So what all of this leads to, this general economic system, is a feeling of real powerlessness, i.e., we can't do anything about it. But you have to remember that material factors are not ever the only thing that shape, what our economy or anything else, because what we think shapes our material circumstances as just as much. So it's another feedback loop. Okay, our ideas feed the material feeds, and the economy, you can switch economy here, and the economy certainly has a great influence over our ideas. Remember about being late in the last chapter. That's just an idea that doesn't exist in many other cultures, So although we're going to start with the material in this chapter, uh, we're also going to apply the power of ideas to understand why the economy as it is as it is, and how it could be different. This is one of the key points, and it's something that just drives me nuts, is that everyone assumes that it has to be this way. Now, that's even in the face of looking at how some of the other industrialized nations manage work life, as I talked about. And I mean, it could be better than they do it, but obviously it can be different. Obviously, it doesn't have to be the way it is in the U.S. Because it otherwise differences wouldn't exist in even other countries with our similar Western industrialized culture. So before we begin, let's talk about two of the most important and powerful economic ideas, capitalism and socialism. Your book doesn't cover this, and I wanted you to understand it in case you didn't. You've probably come across it in other classes, but let's just go over it briefly as a basis to understand it. So the characteristics of capitalism is that the first one is private ownership of the means of production. That means of factories and other businesses, private ownership. Okay. The second is market competition. Okay. How do you sell things in a capitalist society? You are constantly competing with someone else, and that determines how much things cost, what's available. We talked about demand and supply in the last issue, last chapter. We're going to talk about that more with the example of toilet paper, et cetera. And then the third characteristic is profit. The whole reason that you do any of this stuff, that you own a business, that you compete in the market, is for profit. Okay. And that to us is kind of like a no-brainer, right? Because that's a system that we live under. Well, here's what socialism is. By the way, socialism is not communism. Socialism is an economic system. Communism is a political system. Okay. So here's socialism. So you can have socialism in a democracy, just fine. Okay. Socialism is the public ownership of the means of production, like utilities, like factories, like land, like equipment. Okay, the second characteristic is that competition is not a value, but cooperation is the value. So it's cooperation is more important than competition. And the third characteristic is that there's no profit. Okay, no profit motive in this system. And I refer you back to Marx's famous statement: the way an economy should work is from each according to their means or ability, right? To each according to their needs. Now, I want to go back here and clarify a couple of things. For instance, remember the first characteristic is of socialism is the public ownership of things, and they mention utilities as an example. Okay, I'm going to go back to capitalism, the private ownership of the means of production. Utilities, electric, water, gas, all those things are also part of the means of production. So I'm going to give you an example here. If you live south, I'm just using this area. I know you're not all from this area, but hopefully you're familiar with it enough to understand what I'm saying. If you live south of the North Bend Bridge, you have Pacific Power, PP&L or PP&G, whatever, Pacific Power and Light for your electric company. If you live north of the North Bend Bridge, you have the Coos Curry Electric Cooperative. Okay, I live north of the bridge, and my electric bill's about half what it is south of the bridge. Because in a cooperative, a Central Lincoln Public Utility District is what it's called. Okay, now hear the term public, not Central Lincoln Private Utility District, Central Lincoln Public Utility District. So it's not for profit. It yes, we have to pay for our electricity, but what that pays for is the linemen who, run the lines, who repair the stuff, the people who work in the offices, the trucks, the gas, the office rent, blah, blah, blah. But that's it. That's it. There's no built-in profit for a corporation or an owner. So that's an example, a very real and, ever-present example of the difference between something that is owned publicly, not for profit, and something that is owned privately for profit. The thing about market competition is that, of course, the products that that capitalism produces or creates are usually much more innovative than those that are produced by, say, Russia. Their cars are famously a joke. Their fashion is famously a joke, or was certainly when it was in the Soviet system, because nobody's competing to make something, better or fancier or more sleeker design or anything of that nature. So neither system is exactly perfect by any means. I just wanted to point that out to you. And distribution of goods is the same issue. In capitalism, it's about, as we said, market demand. In purely socialistic societies, it's, how many shoes you're going to this part of the country and how many cars to the other, et cetera, is kind of decided. But the other thing I want to point out quickly before we get back into the text is that there is no existing purely either socialistic or democratic society. What Europe has is what's called democratic socialism, which is a combination of capitalism and socialism. So the things that people need to survive, like time off from work and maternity and child and maternity and paternity leave and health care, we're the only nation, the only industrialized nation that doesn't have some form of universal health care for people. Um, those kinds of things are operated without profit for the people. But you can spend a fortune on food in any of those countries, or on clothes, or any private businesses that are around. So everything's a combination now, including in the United States. In that film Sicko, that the clip from France is from, there's a clip with saying, the demon of socialism in America. But I kind of like my police force. I kind of like the fire department. I kind of like the public libraries. I kind of like the public schools, right? That could be called socialism because it's publicly owned. They're not for profit. They're and they're supported through taxation, obviously. Okay, so let's go back to looking at this our system. The one major idea, which is growth. Okay, that's our big thing: growth, economic growth. Okay, that's the only good. In the economic system in our society. Huge emphasis on it. That's where the GDP, gross domestic product, and GNI, man, if it's going up, we must be doing great. Um, and uh, and it's become a central cultural value because we hear it over and over and over and over again, right? So David Corton said, he's a very well-known thinker about the economy. Okay. No single idea is more deeply embedded in modern political culture than the belief that economic growth is the key to meeting important human needs. Okay, that's in America. Okay. And that's true. It's so true. What that does is it encourages not only consumption, but the growth of consumption. You can see how that works, right? You got to keep buying to keep the GDP going up. It's important to note that not all economic growth and consumption in and of itself leads to environmental damage. There's been a growth in green industry. It's, tiny percentage compared to the non-green industry, but we're seeing growth in it. That's a good thing, right? Um, but as I just said, most economic growth does not focus on that. But any that does, you can't say all growth is bad in all sectors, in other words. But because most sectors are bad, then a lot of it is not good. And so what happens is that lobbying by big Wall Street companies creates social pressure for the government to increase the GDP, the gross domestic product. Just remember that's the value of all the goods and services produced in our country, the GDP. And so what happens when that's your main and practically only goal is to increase the number and value of the goods and services produced, then issues of justice across social space and across species are not considered important. They're irrelevant, really, as we know. That's what's gotten into this situation we're in. So central to the promotion of economic growth is social inequality. It's just, when it's set up this way, it has to be that way. So because the slices of the pie aren't big enough for everybody, right? So the solution is thought to be, rather than people saying, well, maybe I don't need that big a slice of pie, our solution is to say the pie needs to be bigger. That's increasing the GDP. But to make the pie bigger, you need more resources to do that, right? You need more water, electricity, gas, fracking, et cetera, et cetera. And they throw in here, imagine if there were no inequality, how that would affect it, in reference to John Lennon's song, Imagine, that beautiful song. Um, it's pretty hard to imagine no inequality, isn't it? But it can be mitigated, certainly. So if there was no inequality, there wouldn't be any Joneses to keep up with. Consumption would largely disappear because everybody's already pretty equal. Not 100% perfectly equal, but pretty equal. Remember the foragers and hunter-gatherers we talked about. So therefore, it's really important to understand that the origins of economic inequality is the central issue, right? Uh, to to understanding the social organization and understanding social organization and how that is the central issue to consider for environmental sociology. How we got here, how that idea of growth and consumption works is this is a crucial aspect of understanding what's going on. Okay, so let's look at the growth compulsion. In most of the world today, money is the primary means for meeting one's material needs, as we know, and in much of the world is virtually the only means to do that. Okay, but money wasn't always that important. I refer you once again, you're going to get sick of hearing this, to A Poor Man Shames Us All. Reciprocity, which is all about what happens in that last story in A Poor Man Shames Us All. You give the man who needs the cattle, or the camel, excuse me, the camel out of your own stock because someday you may need help, right? Someday you may need to go to his group and say, I need a camel. So that's what reciprocity is. Okay? People do that all the time in America with tools and neighbors, right? I'll loan you my chainsaw, and someday I may need to borrow your, I don't know what, fill in the blank, brush cutter, that type of thing. Reciprocity. And then direct market exchange is more like you're buying from the person who actually, well, a farmer's market is an example of direct market exchange, people selling their goods directly. Okay. The first coins are not, people worked without money for a very long time. Also, starting at the halfway point of A Poor Man Shames Us All, you'll get an explanation of how the whole monetary system started working, and the Dutch invented it, the whole banking system and that type of thing. And he starts with coins, you'll see them. So let's look at industrialization, which has been the last 300 years. And what subsistence became, where there's people producing their own goods or trading for them, I'll trade you some eggs for some meat or some produce or something. What happened is that people just started laboring for a wage, and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution was just horrible. People worked, 6 days a week, 16 hours at a time, just, for nothing virtually. So what that shift to industrialization meant was that whatever commodity is being produced in factories has to sell for more, right? It has to sell for more than the inputs of the material cost and the labor cost. There's no profit otherwise. Okay? And so that's what happened with industrialization. And that's called the wage price gap. And it's the basic underlying problem of capitalism. To make a profit, the workers have to be paid less than the price of what they make, okay, for there to be a profit. But then it's hard for the workers to buy all that they make. So they weren't paid enough to do that, right? So if all the workers can't buy all that's being made, how do the capitalists sell enough to pay their workers and still have a profit? Okay. And that's what the wage price gap is is all about, and that's why it's called the problem with capitalism. I'm going to give you an example of Nike. Years ago, in a sociology textbook, the opening vignette was people working in a factory in, I think it was China somewhere, making Nikes. And the total cost that went into making the Nikes was like $3.23 or something. It was labor, materials, everything. And the same pair of Nikes were the ones that were selling for $100, on the street. Or not on the street, but you know what I mean, in the marketplace. So in that case, the wage price gap is very narrow, right? Because you're charging much, much, much more than the value of what it costs to make the thing. But there's generally some kind of a wage price gap. So here's another major problem. The problem and that is a wage price gap. It's just that wage price gap really benefits Phil Knight, right, or the producer. So another major problem, the problem of the original capitalist. So if there's only, think about this, it's really interesting. First capitalist, there's only one, right? And there's only one original worker who works for the capitalist. Okay, so there's two people, the capitalist, the worker. But the worker has to make, remember, less than you want to sell your product for. Because otherwise there's no profit, right? If you paid the person more than the cost of the product, you could buy some of that product yourself, but then there's no profit. In fact, there's a deficit because you put out more to buy the product than you paid the worker. Okay? Well, fortunately for capitalism, as they say, there are lots of workers and lots of capitalists to pay them. So what you do is you don't sell your product to your own worker, you're selling it to someone else's workers. Okay. Nike again. Okay. So Nike's not selling the Nikes to the Chinese laboring in the factory for 25 cents an hour, are they? They're selling their product to people in America who are willing to, the conspicuous consumption, again, they want brand name shoes, to pay way more than they're worth to have them. Okay. So basically, the sum of all workers everywhere have to buy more than what the sum of all workers everywhere were paid if there is to be a profit. And the author suggests reading that sentence again, so I'm going to read it to you again because this is the crux of the issue. Basically, the sum of all workers everywhere must buy more than what the sum of all workers everywhere were paid if there's going to be a profit. Okay? Because profit comes from selling more than you paid out. Your labor costs have to be less than your sales income. This is all just basic, stuff, okay? So the workers are the ones who buy the stuff in the end, and they can't buy more than they were paid. The capitalists themselves can't make up the difference by going on a spending spree like Elvis, because their ability to do so, their money, this is such a crazy, crazy vicious cycle, because their money comes from the profit that they haven't yet made. Because the workers of the world can't collectively buy enough stuff. So even going global doesn't really completely solve the problem. What does solve the problem for the capitalists? How does capitalism work? Well, you saw this in influenza, right, on a micro scale. But now we're also talking about the capitalists who own the means of production. The answer is debt. That's how capitalism works. It's about the only way it can work. It's the only way a country that is deeply invested in capitalism like ours could work too. Think about the national debt. So from the national debt to your personal debt, that's how capitalism works. There has to be debt. The money keeps moving by the use of loans, bills, and wages not yet paid, and various other accounting tricks. So when debts need to be paid in one place, then there's another place to pay them from by promising to pay later, borrowing the money to pay them. You know, the old saying, robbing Peter to pay Paul. I've done it in my life. I'm sure plenty of you have, where you let one bill slide to pay another bill that's more crucial to pay, you know, whatever, keep your lights on, etc., put gas in the car. Okay. So as some of you know, and I lived that way for a long time, I've experienced this. It's a very delicate balancing act, right? Um, so if promises aren't met, or there's any kind of doubt that there will be, the house of cards actually eventually collapses. The house of cards collapse. And this also happens once again with countries and national debt. The first thing that happens is that inflation happens. So we're seeing that right now, right? We're in an increasingly inflationary cycle. Interest rates are going up. Things are beginning to cost more. And so what that means is that money decreases in value. And the only way to avoid the consequences of that type of thing is to have a cushion of some kind. You know, well, most Americans don't even have $400 in savings. So, you know, for example, African Americans have about 40% less wealth than white people in the United States. And in just across the board, most Americans don't even have $400. In an inflationary cycle, even if you had $400 in savings, it wouldn't last very long in making up the difference between pricing of things like food and gas and that type of thing. Now, those with inherited wealth can obviously have a cushion. And, you know, that for the rest of us, sometimes people try to get a second job or, you know, a variety of things. So consequently, most people are constantly trying to find more money just to hold their economic place, to not lose their economic place. So what happens is they begin to act like the market and they seek the highest return and try and minimize costs. And that's called the generalization of the market. And what that does in turn is it promotes political interest in economic growth. So once again, back in the cycle of trying to increase the GDP and economic growth so people can afford things, etc., theoretically, but actually often still, as we're seeing now, the prices of things continue to go up. However, this is the point, there's no guarantee that growth will increase everyone's wealth or everyone's equality. Okay? So in the short term, sometimes economic growth can help resolve political conflict. And boy, are we seeing all of this play out right now. It's so interesting. Because, you know, that's what many politicians hope, is that this you know, more economic growth will help their political party or position. But in the long term, economic growth can only exacerbate the problem, because it's a cycle. The cycles just recur. We've seen them recur over and over and over again in the United States. Another cycle is depression, right? In 2008, it was called a recession, but it was really a depression. And that was caused by markets, okay? Primarily the real estate market. So money in the stampede for more comes from often pressures of investors in companies clamoring for more profits. And then the board of directors has to do something to make more profits. markets, right? So investors, workers, and bosses all want to earn more. I'm sure every one of you would like to earn more. Most people would. Uh, and but if you look at the difference, the discrepancy in pay between workers and CEOs, for instance, you can really see that the huge amounts of executive pay compared to workers. So the treadmill of production is get big or get out. That's what the treadmill in this uh, chapter about economics is. Trying different approaches, you do all kinds of things you can think of to create greater profit. And you try and think of things that your competitors haven't done yet or haven't achieved yet, things like forcing workers to take less pay. Getting a break on environmental regulations, that's a big one. There's companies, obviously. Buying out another firm so you can create a monopoly. Okay. And this often leads, of course, to increases in the environmental impact. We just talked about getting by, waiving environmental regulations. Well, we can't afford to do that. We can't make a profit if we do that, etc. So it leads to environmental impact and also social inequality. Because listen to this, despite overall growth, right? We're in a big growth rate right now. Employment is at its highest in a long, long time, or I should say unemployment is at its lowest. But despite that economic growth, overall economic growth over the years, the incomes have been declining for most people. They're real incomes, adjusted for inflation and deflation and all other things. Incomes have been declining. So now we're going to move to the invisible hand. Adam Smith, if you've taken an economics class, or some of you probably are familiar with this, or from your own, interest in reading. He developed in the 18th century the idea of the invisible hand, and what he said was the invisible hand is that individual competition will guide us all toward prosperity by increasing productivity and efficiency, because productivity and efficiency leads to more profits. So that's the invisible hand. It will lead us to these wonderful and individual competition too. Okay, but there's a more modern concept called the individual elbow, which says, wait a minute, economic actors are constantly shoving and jostling one another for positions, and the way they do that jostling is through what are called externalities. Externalities are economic effects not taken into account in decision making in a market. And there's two very broad categories of externalities. One is the increased inequality and pollution. Those are examples of negative externalities. But there could also be positive externalities. If you developed more efficient production, for example, that would be an example of a positive externality. If you cut corners and got around certain, say, environmental laws or something and increased pollution or social inequality, those would be negative externalities. And that's where the elbowing comes in, the dynamics of that. So what's development in the politics of the growth machine? Don't you like that terminology, the growth machine? Okay. So externalities are easier to see and harder to ignore when they're local, because social ecological ties are affected. So one glaring example of externalities is that even when activists mobilize resistance, business interests usually win in those kinds of politics, right? Usually the business wins out over the activists trying to change something that business is doing. And business leaders almost always advocate pro-growth policies, no matter what the consequences of the growth, okay? So here's the result: a city, a town, or a state that acts like a growth machine dedicated to encouraging almost any kind of economic development. I can't tell you how often I've seen that in this particular community, but it happens everywhere. So, dedicated to encouraging almost any kind of economic growth with very little regard to environmental consequences or the wishes of those who live there. Okay. So think about the story about the confined animal feeding operations in the text here and the people who tried to stop that happening in their community. You got the So here's the other thing that to deal with is the idea of the core nations and peripheral nations and urban versus rural. So corporations know that what's out of sight is out of mind. So to go back to the CAFO again, the confined animal feeding thing, what how would you feel? What would it do to you if every day when you drove to work or school you had to go past a feedlot, the manure ponds, and the slaughterhouse? Okay. And here are the animals, mooing and moaning and all of whatever they are. Uh, it would be way too in your face, right? Really, you wouldn't want to see that. So the companies that do that kind of stuff uh, tend to get out of the urban areas where there's a lot of people into rural areas where not so many people are going to see what's going on or have to face what's actually happening. And they also move to poor countries. Those are the peripheral countries, okay? And then we really don't see them at all, the global south, as it's called, okay? So the poorer countries, this is a key point. Poorer countries are not underdeveloped through an accident of history, okay? Rather, they're peripheral nations. They are periphery nations like Vietnam, Nigeria, or Colombia that provide cheap labor and natural resources to the core countries like the US, Germany, and Japan, for example. Okay. The core countries are the Western, not only Western, because we have Japan in there, but primarily the Western industrialized nations. The peripheral countries are poor countries, often in southern latitudes or southern areas of the world. So the other point here is that not all the core countries, not all the rich countries have equal power in the world system. So at any one time in history, it's dominated by a particular what's called hegemonic state. At one time, it was England with her huge empire. The saying, the sun never sets on the British Empire because it covered every single time zone. It was enormous, and they were the hegemonic power. But now, guess who it is? It's us. Okay. Uh, and the definition of a hegemonic state is a core nation that has productive and financial dominance. Today, it's us. Tomorrow, it's most likely going to be China or India. I'm sure you've heard all of that discussion. So the periphery, those countries that are peripheral nations, the poor countries that do the productive, remember I talked about the shoes and being made in China, et cetera, the Nikes, they're in a resource trap. Now, that was years ago. China is not not a peripheral nation at all anymore. There's still a lot of cheap labor there that's being used. So the peripheral nations are those ones that, Africa, Vietnam. I can't believe how many things are made in Vietnam now. It's really interesting, the Philippines. So they're in a resource trap, those nations, because investment comes from us and other core nations, but hardly any of the profit stays in the country. So they are really not able to develop their own economies. And so consequently, they're trapped in poverty. There's another vicious cycle. What about invisible communities? The things we all purchase, including food, come from some kind of story, right? And often that story appears to be what's in the logos and the packaging and the ads. And we talked about this in the last chapter too. But that's not ever the real story, or certainly not the complete one. And we're not told the consequences of those stories. What's the real stories, right? What that is called is commodity fetishism. And this is a wonderful definition if you think about it. It's a kind of magical thinking about the idea that products just appear, right? You know, there's all that fruit in the store in the middle of winter. Well, where did it come from, right? Things that are completely out of season in our country, things of that nature. Where did all the stuff in the dollar store that I referred to earlier, where did that come from, right? What's the story, right? The idea of magical thinking that products just appear, poof, there they are, and you don't think beyond that. Ready for sale. So I'm going to tell you my Walmart story. When Walmart first came here, I decided to go, years ago, obviously, I decided to go in and check it out. And guess what I found? I found silk pants for $10. Women's silk pants, inseam pockets. Inseam pockets are not patch pockets. They're the ones that your hands go in the seam. And I bought 2 pair because they were so gorgeous. They were raw silk, 2 different colors. I brought them home. I showed them to my husband, Peter. Look at what I found. And he said, Christina, you know what's involved in making a pair of pants, particularly with inseam pockets. You know how long it takes. You know how much silk costs. Think about the people who made them if you bought them for $10. Well, here's the backstory to that conversation. I, for years, made clothing and sold the clothing at crafts fairs up and down the West Coast and in Eugene a lot at the Saturday market. So yes, I know. I labored away on my sewing machine during the week. Could make a dress a day, sometimes a little bit more. I know what the production was in terms of cutting, shopping for the fabric, all of that. I know what the materials cost. I know how long it took. And, you couldn't even buy the material for $10, let alone pay me anything to do it. So that was my Walmart experience with cheap clothes. But you get the point. They just magically appeared. Wonderful pants for nothing, practically. There was a backstory to that, and I was grateful to be reminded of it. What about the agricultural workers slaving away in the fields in horrible conditions generally, along with the herbicides and pesticides they get sprayed with? And then there's the factory farms and the animal feeding lots and the slaughterhouses and the packing plants. All of those have backstories that aren't so nice. Now we're going to move on. That was the invisible communities section, to overproduction and underproduction. So here's 2 especially important and fundamental challenges to producers. One is the crisis of overproduction. So this is what the treadmill theory describes of production, that the pinching and elbowing still occur because overproduction lowers profit margins and makes the production treadmill go even faster, right? But the crisis of underproduction, sometimes the producers undermine or destroy the very social environmental relations that makes their productions possible. I think an interesting, in a different way, but similarly as well, is the recent Amazon voting in New York, voting to unionize. Amazon, here, what does this say? The crisis of underproduction. This isn't underproduction, but it's how you treat people in this case. So sometimes underproduction. Sometimes producers undermine and destroy the very social and environmental relations that make production possible. That's what happened at that plant. It just got so bad that it wasn't going to work anymore. There was going to some kind of a crisis brewing, and luckily it had a positive outcome with union organizing and winning. But a more material example of that is fishing, which is a great example, as you know from reading the text. So the harvests and fishing industry have been so large that insufficient spawning stock remain to repopulate the fish. Well, then people get really nervous because the fish are disappearing, so they fish even more until the stocks completely collapse. Kind of like that fennel, when we see the last whatever breed of fish is the most endangered, the last of them. That used to be a big business, whatever it was. So, my comment after reading that was, duh. I mean, how unconscious and unaware and greedy can people be? If you see stocks are dwindling because of overfishing, the solution is to stop overfishing, not to overfish more. It's just logic. But people are so caught up in that growth and that idea of profit and afraid, quite frankly. I know I'm sounding very judgmental, but I understand people are afraid for their livelihoods. But in the end, it destroys it. So it's quite interesting. So the key point here is that more efficient, in quotes, production can actually increase resource use until there's simply nothing left. Like Dr. Seuss's The Lorax, as your book says. That's, if you remember that from childhood, it's a great metaphor. So what's the metabolic rift? Isn't that a great name? Well, here's what it is. The human use of the earth could be mutually constitutive, where human beings gain the nutrients necessary for subsistence, and then you later return those nutrients to the earth, which yields more nutrients. It's a good feedback loop. Sounds great. But as I'm sure you know, our economic structures completely discourage such regeneration. What our current economy does is it divides human production from ecological conditions, and that's what the metabolic rift is. Metabolic rift, the division of human production from our ecological conditions. So the case in point is this constant abuse of the soil, of artificially fertilizing the soil over and over and over again until it's practically worn out. And then also the fertilizer stocks are worn out, like phosphates and things of that, and you can't regenerate that out of the earth that took, thousands of years or if not more to make, any more than you can regenerate oil. So it's just, anyway, that's the rift. And I wanted to bring up somewhere here. Oh yeah, let's see, burials. Okay, so I think your book brings it up. I'll just wait till we get there at some place. Okay. Another aspect of the metabolic rift is the rift between the city and the country, which isolates people from the ecological processes upon which they depend. You could live in the city, never go to the country, and never really get what's going on out there in terms of the natural world and how that system works. But that's what we depend on for survival. So an example here, you can read some stories about this, is there's been a lot of effort among certain groups to get kids that are from the inner city out into the country. And many of them have never seen big trees or forests or farmland, and certainly don't know where their food comes from. And you get a lot of, oh my God, yucks about cows and milk and, chickens and eggs and all of those things, because it's not their fault, by the way. But that's the disconnect. And the reason to get them out of the city and out into nature and or understanding where their food comes from, and also community gardens do that as well for children, is to have that connection, to understand that Milk doesn't just come from the grocery store in a plastic jug. There's that backstory we talked about behind it all. Okay, so that urban rural thing is really important. And the other thing, this is where the burials are, is in my notes, is saying we take nutrients from the earth, but we never replace them. Well, now there's a movement towards natural burials of putting bodies, because your book refers to putting bodies in coffins, where you just bury people naturally without a lot of embalming, not necessarily in coffins, et cetera, et cetera. You can Google natural burials and find out what those are about. But that's putting nutrients back in the earth. It's kind of a nice way to be recycled if you think about that. So, what is the constructed market? Um, Basically, this idea of freedom. Okay, so the relationship between the state and a free market. Um, and so there is no free market. There's a ton of regulations, and you ought to be grateful they're there, or you'd be poisoned by your food and diseases from meatpacking plants and a whole bunch of other things. So you've got to have regulations, health and safety ones for sure. You have to have, and so the free market is not free. It can't be. And I love the two kinds of freedom that Isaiah Berlin mentions. Talks about the freedom from, which is the freedom from others stopping you from doing what you want and need to do, and the freedom to, which is the freedom to take agency over the conditions of your life. And that's a really powerful one. So let's look at corporations and regulations for a moment. There's this thing that a huge loophole for corporations, which is that the Supreme Court decided many years ago that corporations have the same protections as natural persons in the Constitution. And so that even if corporations go bankrupt or they are sued, the owners and investors aren't liable. So there's often no recourse for injury. Bhopal, that we studied, was a perfect example of that. Now let's look at classic liberalism and classic neoliberalism real fast. Liberalism, I'm sure you know. Well, first of all, let's start with Ronald Reagan's quote, which they've put in here: "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language. I'm from the government and I'm here to help." To me, those are not terrifying words. To me, those are salvation words. Yeah, help fix the roads. Help us have a fire department, help us have schools, et cetera, et cetera. Help us have universal health care, please, which is more what Roosevelt was about. They mentioned Roosevelt as well. So privatization is a real case in point here, where the idea of outsourcing from the government, because we don't want government doing things, right? So now the prisons in the United States, as of 2016, almost half of our 1.5 million incarcerated people in the United States are in privately owned prisons. We have the highest incarceration rate of any nation. It's just shocking and disgusting. Well, let me tell you a story. I heard a news story years ago on NPR when I was driving that in the state of Oregon, the guy who was running one of the prisons was so pleased because they got prison meals down to 25 cents a meal to costing. Now, imagine what that food is like at 25 cents a meal. But if there's a profit motive, then there's a motive to do that. And that was a privately owned prison. Okay. So ideologically, how did we come up with this idea of outsourcing to corporations? How did they get mixed up with government and outsourcing government stuff? And it's primarily through this ideological transformation called neoliberalism. So it's very confusing, these terms, liberalism and neoliberalism. In the modern United States, liberalism, you know what it means. Support for public ownership, government services, regulation of the market. Good health, clean air, education, health. Neoliberalism comes from an 18th century concept. 19th century concept that was individual freedom from the aristocracy. including private property rights and that type of thing against the feudal control. And so that's been applied now to protecting the rights of privilege. It's extended to, instead of from the individuals having private property rights and all kinds of personal rights, it's extended to corporations. That's what neoliberalism is, to protecting the rights and privileges of corporations, which, of course, as we just saw, due to those ideologies, are now legally defined as individuals. And so, thus, as your author points out, neoliberalism isn't liberal at all. It's just the opposite. So the treadmill within. I'm going to not get all the way to the end of these notes to finish, so you don't have to have a second video. But the point here is this idea of hard work and the virtue of hard work and how important it is. And if we work more than hours than any other country, the US and Japan. And we have less vacation time and leisure time than any other country. You can see that. And once again, in the French thing, you can Google it with Scandinavian and other countries. So, but they're internalized treadmills too that we believe in, and they're very powerful cultural values. And they serve corporations and they serve people who own the means of production, because they encourage people to keep plodding away at these treadmills of work, because if you're not doing that, then you're lazy. So but to demonstrate your success in attaining the virtue of profit or making money, then you need to consume more to show that you've done it. Okay, so the virtue of hard work keeps us going on the production treadmill by helping to rationalize the inequalities of consumption. Well, I have a nice car because I work hard. Oh my goodness, we've heard that a lot. Okay, our saying "God helps those who help themselves" is another thing. So if you're not doing well in our nation with this ideology, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. It's your fault if you're not succeeding financially. Then it's a personal fault, not a societal one, according to that ideology, right? So the social creation of economics is important. Capitalism is not a force of nature; it's a force of politics, the political economy, and ideology. And we're often told that if we don't like the results, it's because we, quote, just don't understand what our interests and sentiments are. So what's really true is that economic circumstances are actually the result of bargaining among state, labor, and management. I'd love to talk to you more about labor unions. I don't have time right now. Suffice it to say that Ronald Reagan killed labor unions in the United States, but they're having a resurgence since COVID. It's so very, very, very interesting. So economics create society, but societies create economics just as equally. Feedback loop again, which means it can be recreated in a healthier way. If you want to see that, check out that final section in this chapter about Rocksteady Farm, that's employee owned and managed, and also to tell you that Bimart is employee owned. So one of the ways you can show how you feel about these things is maybe change some of your buying habits to companies that are employee owned or things of that nature, or are unionized. All right, I'll see you next week.